I was saying, my incredibly poor sense of timing has caused that story not to be finished, which actually was what we call a filler story, which I was making up in order to finish up the end of the tape. But I shall finish it because it became incredibly incredible. At this point in time, the people who saw that their house was completely messed up with a single pickle left in the middle of the floor or table, picked up that pickle, tossed it in the compost bin, and during the summer it turned into dirt. Well, you know something? That pickle was happy because originally the pickle thought, oh, I just want to be put in a sandwich like all the other pickles. But now the pickle was turned into dirt and was put into the garden. Guess what those people grew? They grew cucumbers. The pickle remembered as he grew into a cucumber from the nutrients of the soil, which was made out of his own body. He realized, wait a minute, I was a cucumber in a previous life. And somehow I got turned into a pickle. Finally, now I'm a cucumber. And when he came to that realization, he was picked off the cucumber plant by a small child named Henrietta Masconi, who brought the pickle, who was now a cucumber, inside, chopped it up, and put it into a salad. And the pickle was eaten by several people in the family. Now, that pickle was digested and flushed down the toilet and washed away to the sewage treatment facility, where it once again was composted by natural means and turned into dirt. And that dirt, that soil, was used by farmers to grow cucumbers. And the moral of the story is that even if you are a pickle stuck in a refrigerator and you think you want to be eaten, if you're eaten too quickly, then you'll never have a chance for woodland animals to play toss the pickle with you. Now, this might be one of the stupidest stories you've actually ever heard, but I will remind you of this saying from an ancient tribe of pickle eaters. It goes like this: think not that a story about pickle has no meaning. Think rather that the meaning has no pickle. On behalf of the producers of the tape, I'd like to apologize for the previous story. Not only was it nonsensical and, quite frankly, idiotic, but hearing the story come out of my mouth annoyed even me, the teller of the story. And for that, I'd like to apologize not only to any potential listeners of the story and to people who are listening to this apology as it is being played, but also to the tape itself, which is forced to record the story onto its magnetic medium. I'd like to apologize to everybody concerned, and hopefully nothing like that will ever occur for the future of this tape. Once upon a time, there was a mosquito named Frank, which in mosquito language translates to Bob. He lived on the head of a giant in his massive swirls of hair. The giant's name was Bob, coincidentally, which in giant language translates to Marvin Snivelpop. Well, it's Snivelpop. Yeah, it's Snivelpop. Pop, 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 snivel, pop. Well, it's snivel, pop. Snivel, snivel, pop. Snibble, 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 pop. Pop, pop, pop. Snibble, pop, snibble, pop, snibble, pop, 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 pop. Well, you get the idea. So the mosquito was living in his head, and the giant found that to be quite itchy. And he thought that actually his hair was itching him, so he shaved off all of the hair from his head, and he became a giant who was bald, or a bald giant. And yet his head was still itching, and he let out this yell because he was so startled, because when he looked in the mirror, he saw this huge mosquito stuck with his proboscis digging down into his scalp, sucking out a little bit of the giant's blood. The giant was startled. He yelled. Well, that startled the mosquito, as you can imagine, Bob or Frank. And Frank, the mosquito, his proboscis kind of froze up and twisted a little bit when the giant yelled like that, and it got stuck in the giant's head. And so then the giant was like, I'm going to get that mosquito, and he reached up on top of his head to try to swat at the mosquito. The mosquito got scared and started flying. Well, this was actually a very powerful mosquito because it was really a giant mosquito, and his wings were powerful enough to pull Bob up into the air. And so he started flying around with Bob attached to him. So now we had a flying giant. He pulled Bob's head up, and Bob was attached to his head, of course. Marvin Snivelpop. And so the giant actually liked this quite a bit, because suddenly he was flying around. And so the giant made a deal with a mosquito. He told them. And mosquitoes and giants speak basically a dialect of the same language. And he said that what I'll do is I will not swat you, but all you have to do is fly the direction I tell you to. Mosquito thought that was a great idea because he could continue to suck blood out of the giant's head, and he was stuck in the giant's head anyway. So the mosquito flew the giant to various villages where the giant would land, and a flying giant coming down from the sky is rather scary. And he would land in the villages and stomp around and and crush the huts and terrorize people. He did that a couple of times, and in the third village, he saw there was something going on in one of the little houses. And it looked like a little, straw thatched hut house with a lot of light. And he opened the door, and it looked like it was some sort of stand-up comedy routine. It sounded like this.
Well, Anakin, he's just crazy. I mean, he's got to make up his mind. Does he want to be a Jedi or a Sith? What is wrong with Anakin? And Frodo, he's a coward. They give him a sword. He's like, huh? He throws it right behind his shoulder, and he knocks out his best friend, and then he starts running around in circles. What's with him? And what about airplane food? What's with that stuff? And tomatoes, are they a fruit or a vegetable? Really, man, who knows? Good times, people, good times.
Yeah, and so the giant was so terrorized from that stand-up comedy routine that he left the village, and he never scared any villages anymore, and he just flew around his own hometown, entertaining his own giant relatives. The end. This is a story about a goat named Billy. He wasn't a very smart goat, Billy the goat. Some might say he was dumb, but how smart do goats have to be anyway? Mostly they just need to be able to know when and where and what to eat. They do have to know that when they get to an edge of a hole, they should stop. Sadly, Billy wasn't quite that smart, and so when he got to the edge of this particular hole, he kept walking, and he fell. He fell quite a distance, but he was okay when he landed. He landed in an intricate system of tunnels built by the mole men who inhabit the world underneath the surface of our planet, in the Earth's crust. Mole men are human-like creatures who have evolved in the darkness and the 58 degrees Fahrenheit of the subterranean world. Billy was wandering around, and he did see some actual moles who, the rodent-type creatures that were burrowing around as well, and Billy figured that he must himself be a mole, and he continued walking down one of the tunnels until he came to a laboratory of the mole men. They were working on one of their amazing experiments, and they saw Billy, and Billy said, "I am a mole." Now, Billy was speaking goat language, but the mole men were so intelligent and had been listening to the vibrations from the surface of the planet for so long that they actually understood goat language, and they thought, wow, this is some sort of goat mole, and they were very excited to see Billy, and they decided to use him in their experiments, and they beckoned him over, and Billy, wanting to hang out with the other mole men, walked up to the mole men and asked them what they were doing, and they showed him their huge machines that were fashioned out of the roots of trees and small kangaroo droppings that had been left on the ground, because actually their tunnels go all the way through the earth to Australia from the Michigan and Rhode Island areas. So occasionally a kangaroo will fall into a hole, especially if the mole men burrow too close to the surface and the surface of the ground is a little bit weak. The kangaroos will fall through and tumble down into the holes where they will poop, because often when a kangaroo falls down a hole and tumbles for a while, it ends up pooping. The mole men shuffle the kangaroos back out again, but it is a continuous problem, the kangaroos in the holes of the mole men. So the kangaroo people were working, actually I failed to call them mole men because they weren't actually kangaroo people. The kangaroo people are part of another story. They live in another set of tunnels on another planet. This is about the mole men, and they were building this machine to help them inhabit the surface of the earth, because there's one thing that the mole men really were upset about was humans, because humans have dominated the surface of the earth for so long, and they've polluted the air, and they stink up the ground with their farts and they stomp all over the place, and they're loud, and those vibrations. I don't know if you've ever lived underneath a loud neighbor who walks around up on this with wood floors and the ceiling above you. It's very annoying. I mean, sometimes they'll wake you up at 6 in the morning when they get ready to go out jogging, and it sounds like they're rolling bowling balls across the ceiling, and you go crazy, and you take a broom handle and you smash it up against the ceiling, and you say, "Stop the noise up there!" And then the people who live below you get mad at you because now you're making all the noise. Well, as you can see, it's a chain reaction of annoyance, and the people who are annoyed at the very end of this chain reaction are, of course, the mole men, because they're underneath everybody else. So the mole men have been angry with people, or that is to say human people, for a long time because of the noise that they make. And so they decided that they would have to take over the surface of the planet and stick the humans underneath where they've had to live and evolve with no vision, by the way. The mole men are blind because they evolved that in darkness. And they figured, well, after a few 100,000 years, when humans have evolved to be blind mole men type people, then we can all get along again, because then we'll have much more in common. That was the plan of the mole men. So they were working on one of their machines. They've been working on this plan for over 600 years. Actually, just 3 days over 600 years. And their plan was to create a machine that could hide them while they were up on the surface, so that nobody noticed that they were all coming up on the surface, until they were ready to jump out and surprise the humans and kick them down into the holes and close the lids. They were going to put lids on all of the holes. So that it wasn't, I didn't say it was the most brilliant plan in the world, but it's all they had at the time. So they decided to build when they saw Billy, they decided to change their plan, because they were going to create a large kangaroo. They thought maybe, since there are so many kangaroos up on the surface of the planet, as far as they knew, because the kangaroos kept falling down into their world, that perhaps it would be best to build hollow kangaroo machines and hide inside the kangaroos. But when they saw Billy, the goat mole, they realized that there were probably more goat moles like him up on the surface, and so they would build a large goat-shaped animal, and Billy could help pull it along, because it doesn't have any way of propelling itself, so it has to be pulled. So they were changed their plans, and for 2.5 weeks, while they fed Billy roots and small leaves that fell through the holes down into the mole man holes, they built this goat. It was about 200 feet long. It was a very large goat, but they had a lot of mole men that had to fit inside of it. And so finally, they got it all ready, and they all climbed inside of it, even the little baby mole men, and the mole women, who were, strangely enough, also called mole men. And they asked Billy to pull it. They put it on wheels up to the surface of the planet, because they wanted to invade the surface and jump out and surprise the humans and kick them all down into the holes. And so Billy did this. It was not easy, but he pulled, and he pulled. It was on wheels, but Billy had been working out down there in the tunnels until he got really strong shoulder muscles. And he pulled and pulled and pulled, because he thought he was a mole man by that time, and decided that, well, I've got to help rid the world of the surface-dwelling humans. And he pulled and pulled, and he got that gigantic goat up on the surface of the planet. As you can imagine, a gigantic goat, pulled by another goat, got a lot of attention. And it even got the attention of Mary McFeaselbottom. Mary McFeaselbottom had a small poodle, a very delicately coiffed animal. That is to say, it had nicely combed hair, but it was a very, very vicious poodle. And when it saw the goats, it started barking and barking. This scared Billy, because it was quite a brutal poodle. And he started yelling, "Brutal poodle!" at the poodle, because it was so brutal. And he still had the harness attached to himself with the giant goat behind him. And Billy started running away from the brutal poodle. And he was running and running and running. And then there was a fat cat in front of him. He turned the corner until he saw a bird turd, which he slipped on and started falling down the hill because there happened to be a hill right in front of him. So Billy was falling down a hill, and falling after Billy was a 200-foot-long, gigantic fake goat filled with mole men. And they fell down this hill until they got to the bottom of the hill, which was actually a zoo. Was at the bottom of the hill, Roger Williams Park's Zoo in Providence and Rhode Island, and the goat fell over and smashed open, and the mole men flew in the air and landed in the kangaroo enclosure, coincidentally. And suddenly, the mole men looked around themselves, and they saw that there were kangaroos everywhere. And the kangaroos were quite surprised to see an exploding gigantic goat shooting out mole men. And the kangaroos didn't know what to do. They were standing there kind of with their jaws open, staring at the mole men. And the mole men at that point realized that it was the kangaroos who had been making all that noise. I mean, after all, why would there be so many kangaroos? They had forgotten what humans looked like. It had been 1.3 million years since any mole men had seen any kangaroos. And in fact, they still couldn't see. They only knew when I say what they looked like, I meant that the mole men were feeling around, and the kangaroos were so startled they were afraid to move, while the mole men groped their faces. The mole men were actually reaching out and feeling the shapes of the people around them, and they realized that the people were all kangaroos, the same creatures that had been rolling down into their holes all this time. So, as you can imagine, the mole men instantly realized what they had to do. They had to get these kangaroos down into the hole. And just then that brutal poodle came, and which caused chaos in the kangaroo and mole men and goat enclosure. And but luckily Mary grabbed her poodle. She finally got the brutal poodle by the collar and pulled him away, because she had no idea what to make of these mole men, and the zoo people and the officials were all running around trying to see what was going on. But there was a chance still to make their plan work, and the mole men instantly, they were incredible hole diggers. They started digging a hole right there in the middle of the kangaroo enclosure, and they began to kick the kangaroos until all of the kangaroos fell down into the hole. There were at least 23 kangaroos at this particular zoo. They all fell into the hole, and the mole men reached around to feel around. They didn't feel any other kangaroos, so they thought at least they made a start, and they put a lid on top of the hole. And they were very thankful to Billy for having saved the surface of the planet from these kangaroo people. And the humans, the actual surface-dwelling humans that the mole men weren't aware existed, were circling around the kangaroo enclosure, and they realized, oh wow, these mole men creatures and their leader, this goat mole, they're a great attraction. People come to see this more than they would come to see any old kangaroos. And so they very quietly fixed the fence and everything around, and people did come. And the mole men and Billy were actually quite comfortable in that enclosure, living there for quite some time. But the kangaroos, meanwhile, underground, were not happy at all, because they were very annoyed by all the noise above their head. I mean, it wasn't so bad living underground. They were a little discombobulated and startled at first, but then they realized, there's plenty to eat down here, and because the mole man had, of course, collected lots of food, they actually picked lots of root vegetables from people's gardens from underneath and pulled them down. But there was a lot of noise, a lot of people walking around above their heads, and cars driving overhead, and they couldn't get much sleep. And so they started wandering through the tunnels until finally they reached Australia, and they popped up into the light, which was blinding to them because they had been underground for so long. And there they saw some of their old relatives from Australia, and they were happy because really kangaroos should be hanging out with other kangaroos in Australia. That's what I've always said, and that's what the kangaroos always thought. And so they got there, and the kangaroos lived happily ever after. Meanwhile, Billy and the goat people were hanging out in that kangaroo enclosure until the goat people started wondering, who keeps feeding us if we sent all of the human surface dwellers underground. And they were wondering about this because they kept getting their food just brought to them in the zoo without any effort on their part. And that's when they realized that it must be the kangaroos, that what they sent underground, which in reality were kangaroos, must have been the humans, and the kangaroos that they've heard so much about, or talked so much about in any case, must be very happy to have them there and be feeding them. And they thought, well, why would they do that? And of course it was because of that terrible, ferocious, brutal poodle who had been chasing them all around and caused this whole accident to occur. But they realized they must have saved the kangaroos from the brutal poodle. And to thank them, the kangaroos clearly have decided to feed and take care of the mole men. 2.5 million years later, the mole men actually evolved eyesight in future generations, and when that happened, they started interacting more with the humans on the surface of the planet. Now, what I didn't tell you before was that exactly two of the kangaroos who had been pushed down underground, and a couple of the kangaroos from Australia who had since then fallen, this is 2.5 million years in the past, into those holes, had been breeding and evolving underground all of this time. And 2.5 million years into the future, they also had lost their eyesight, and they had become kangamoles, and they were quite annoyed at that time with the noise on the surface, although most of the cars finally were hovercraft. It took almost 2 million years to get to the hovercraft stage, but so the cars weren't making much noise, but all of the humans and former mole men who had evolved into seeing mole men, and the goat, the future descendants, as we call them, of the goats, were still quite noisy, and so the kangaroos, the kangamoles who lived underground, had decided that they would have to rid the surface of the planet of all of these annoyingly loud people, and so they came up with a plan. And their plan at first involved sneaking up onto the surface of the planet, and because kangamoles had incredible kicking power because they were descendants of kangaroos, they thought they would kick them into the holes and make them live down there, much as the mole men had planned to do 2.5 million years before. Well, it turned out that one of the descendants of Billy the goat was also named Billy 2.5 million years into the future. And he happened to be out walking one day when he got to the edge of a hole, and just like his ancestor 2.5 million years before, he kept walking and fell down that hole until he himself was in this system of tunnels that was populated by kangamoles. The kangamoles instantly heard the vibrations of Billy, the future goat, falling into their world. They walked up to him, and he asked them what was on their feet. You see, kangamoles had not only evolved to live a comfortable life down there in the holes of underground, but they also had invented very spongy, soft socks to wear on their feet because there was a lot of rocks down there. Now, when the mole people lived down there millions of years before, they had evolved very tough, calloused feet, so they didn't mind walking down on the sharp, pointy rocks that, as you may know if you've ever been spelunking underground, there are a lot of sharp rocks sometimes if it's not made smooth by flowing water, for example. And so in the caves and the tunnels underground, the kangamoles, who hopped from place to place, so their tunnels had to be fairly high ceilinged, they would land on these sharp rocks, and so millions of years before they had invented these cushiony socks that they wore on their feet. And they actually came up to him, and they thought that he was some sort of goat-roo, or Kanga mole goat, and in fact, Billy himself assumed that's what he was, because why else would he be hanging around all of the Kanga moles? And he was asking them about those socks, and they spoke his language because they had been listening to the vibrations from the surface for quite some time, and they said that they protected the feet. And he said, "Well, I bet the those creatures on the surface would love those things. They look so comfortable." And the Kangamole said, "Well, what a coincidence. We happen to be on our way up the surface to rid the surface of all of those noisy people up there. Would you like to come with us?" And Billy said, "Yes, but can I bring some socks along for my friends?" And they said, "Well, okay, but we will be kicking them down into the holes." And Billy said, "Well, that's fine, because I'm with you. I, too, am a Kanga goat mole." And so they built a gigantic Kanga goat, just like the ancestors of the mole men had done, and they had Billy pull it up to the surface. It was quite a coincidence, because this had happened 2.5 million years before, but nobody remembered that it had happened, except for you listening to this tape and me telling you this tape, and the mosquito, which is buzzing around the ceiling right now, which has a recording device installed in the back of its head for playing back to the other mosquitoes who enjoy these kinds of stories. And so Billy and the Kangamoles went up to the surface, and they jumped out of that goat, because this time there was no Brutal Poodle to scare them away. And they jumped out of that goat and started jumping around, and people were quite entertained. And Billy ran with the socks. He got a bundle of socks and started handing them to his friends, the mole men of the future, who were kind of like humans actually, and to the other surface dwellers. And people really loved these things, and the kangaroos noticed that the people weren't scared of them, and they were about to kick them down when they also noticed that they weren't making so much noise anymore, because the spongy socks actually cushioned their walk, and they put them over their shoes. And so now it was very quiet on the surface of the planet, because nobody was making those loud running around sounds that sound like rolling a bowling ball in the apartment above your head. And so the kangaroos thought, hey, well, if that's the case, all we have to do is get our socks onto the feet of every creature who lives on the surface of the planet that weighs more than 3.5 ounces. And so they decided to do that. So they went into great sock production, and they went back in their holes, and they pulled up all these socks, and they shared them with the surface people. And in exchange, because the surface people were so comfortable in these socks, they decided to give something back to the Kangamoles, which was, besides giving them, of course, peace and quiet, which is all they really were asking for, they gave them an autographed picture of Billy the Kangamole to bring down into their world. Although they themselves were blind and couldn't see it, it was drawn in three-dimensional paint, so they could feel it on the canvas. And so they brought that back down, and exactly 6 million years later, their culture had evolved a bit since the previous 2.5 million year later period, and they actually believed themselves to be descendants of goats, because they still had that ancient picture of Billy, and they had been feeling it, and it had worn down a bit, but they did think that they all were goats. And so when they emerged to the surface of the planet, because actually 6 million years later they just got bored of living down in the holes, so then when they hopped back up on their own to the surface of the planet, and by that time all of the surface creatures had evolved soft feet, so they didn't even need the socks. They quickly went to the goat population, which were all the descendants of Billy and his friends, and they hung out with them. And so Billy and all of his billy goat friends believed that they were actually kangaroos. And so the goats began to hop around. And that is how the Kanga goat will come into being nearly 10 million years from now. A hopping goat with very soft feet. And I just wanted to tell you this story so that you would know what the future will bring. The end.
Hey, narrator, you lost your job.
What? What are you talking about?
You lost your job. Now get the heck out of here. I'm taking over. Once upon a time, Frodo was trying to trade in the ring for Lord of the Rings collectibles, but no one wanted it. Everyone thinks it's a fake. Then Sam told Frodo not to sell it, and he knocks Sam out with the bottom of the sword. When Sam got up, he said, "Mr. Frodo, you have bad temper." Then Frodo said, "It's the real ring." The ring wraith swooped over and grabbed the ring. Then Gandalf said, "Get that ring or I'll kick your butt." So Frodo wanted to knock out the Black Rider with the bottom of the sword. So he did. Smeagol, aka Gollum, jumped out. Sam gave him a fake ring from a cereal box. Then Frodo saw that the ring was on the dragon. Part 2. So Frodo went to a shopkeeper and bought a dragon whistle. He used it. In 20 seconds, a 2,000-foot-long dragon came. They got on They got on the dragon, and they chased the other dragon. Sadly, their dragon got distracted by a dragonfly and starts chasing it in circles. But luckily, they see that the other dragon drops the ring into the ancient forest. They land and ask the trees about it. "You mean this ring?" asks an old tree holding the ring on a twig. "Yes," says Frodo. "I'll give it to you if you can guess which branch it's on." And the tree puts his branches behind his trunk. Frodo guesses that one. He is right. The tree gives Frodo the ring. Part 3. They had a party, and while Frodo is dancing, he accidentally knocks Sam out with the bottom of his sword. The end. Da, da, da.
Okay. While the other narrator is away, I think he's in the other room. I'm going to shut the door. That's me shutting the door so that he can't hear this. And now I have the microphone again. So now it's my turn, and I am the rightful narrator. So I think it is time for me to sing another song. It goes something like this. I have a head that's made of cheese. Imagine that. It's sharp cheddar cheese. No, it's not flat. I have a head that's made of cheese. You must believe me, please. I have a head that's made of cheese. Imagine that. I have a head that's made of cheese, and that's good. I have a head that's made of cheese, not made of wood. I like to spread it on a cracker, and as a matter of factor, I would eat nothing but my head if I could. I have a head that's made of cheese, and that's fine. I like to eat it at nice parties and sip wine. Some people think it is quite strange. They think I am deranged. But when they taste my cheesy head, they change their mind. I have a head that's made of cheese, but it's not stinky. If it were that way, I'd throw it in the sinky. But then my cheese would get wet, and I cannot let it yet, 'cause it would melt and become shrinky-dinky. I have a head of cheese, and I must say, I do not know how my head got this way. Perhaps I drank milk in the sunlight, and turned to cheese the next night. That's just a theory I came up with yesterday. No matter how my head turned into cheese, I offer you a piece, if you please. But do not eat too much of me, because I am so hungry. And as I eat my head, please don't you tease. And now for something completely different. A story about Darth and Joe Vader. When Darth was 10 years old and Joe was about 8 years old, and they were volunteering with a group of people up in space between Romulan 4 and Romulan 6. It was a vast field of space slugs. And space slugs, as you may not know, live up in space. They're a protected species because there aren't that many of them. For a long time, people didn't know they existed because they eat radiation, that is, different forms of light. And so when people would aim their telescopes up the space slugs and look for the reflected radar or infrared light or different kinds of frequencies of light, they wouldn't see anything because that light was eaten by the space slugs. They're a peaceful creature, essentially, living out there in space. And Darth and Joe Vader were with a group of people collecting space slugs with big spongy nets to move them out of the way because it was an enormous asteroid the size of about 2.5 times the planet Earth coming toward the space slugs, that field of space slugs, and surely it would kill them all. So Darth and Joe were collecting the space slugs to move them to a safe space away from the gigantic asteroid, which is a lot easier than moving an asteroid 2.5 times the mass of the planet Earth. And so it was all going pretty well, and by the end of the day, they had collected the space slugs and moved them to a safe location out of the way of the asteroids. And Darth and Joe landed on Romulan 4 to try to get some sort of ice cream-like product, which is made out of wood chips that they have on that planet. And Joe turned around and looked at their spaceship and said, "Hey, look, what? On the ship, it's a little space slug." And Darth looked, and sure enough, there was a small baby space slug stuck to the side of their ship. It was no more than maybe a couple loaves of bread in size. And they thought it was so cute. And Joe said, "Hey, can we keep it, Darth? It could be a pet." And Darth said, "Well, I don't know how to take care of space slugs." And so they decided to take it to a vet and ask some questions about it. So they pulled it off the ship, and they carried it in a cardboard box, which was actually made out of cucumbers, to the local vet, who said, "Wow, you got a space slug there?" And they said, "Yes, we're going to keep it as a pet, and we're not quite sure. We know that it eats light." And sure enough, it was hard to see the space slug because the light that went into it mostly got absorbed. But it doesn't seem too happy. It's very sluggish. We know it's a slug, but it's not moving around much. And the vet said, "Well, this space slug should be in space. It's far too hot on the planet here." And Darth said, "Well, can we put it in like a freezer or something? Would that be better?" And the vet said, "Well, it'd be too moist in a freezer. Space slugs need to live in space. This one's not going to do well if you try to keep it out of space." And so they thanked the vet, took it back to the ship, and they decided to build a little cage, or some kind of living quarters for it, and keep it in space. And so they did. They built a cage for the space slug, and they flew it up into space and put it in orbit around the planet. And they put little orange markers around the cage so nobody's spaceship would bump into it. And they kept the space slug up there, and they visited every day, and they fed it, and they thought it was such a cute space slug. They named their space slug Ralphie Artichoke. And one day, Darth and Joe, it was a Wednesday, went up to go feed the space slug, and they noticed that it wasn't there. The cage was empty. "Ralphie? Ralphie!" they called, but in space, nobody can hear you call Ralphie Artichoke because there's not enough air to vibrate and send the sound waves around. And they looked around, the cage was still closed, and they were feeding it. They had been going there to feed it, by the way, with flashlights. They had been aiming flashlights at it, too, because it absorbed the light, and that's what it ate. And they had brought new flashlights with them to feed it, and it didn't look like it had eaten all the light that was there before. Some was still bouncing around and leaving the cage, and something very strange had happened. And then they looked more carefully at the cage, and they were in spacesuits at the time, floating around. And Joe said, look here, it looks like some sort of burn mark. So they brought the cage back into their spaceships and looked carefully at it. And sure enough, from the outside, the bars had been burned a little bit and moved to the side, and which made Darth and Joe think that somebody had stolen Ralphie Artichoke. And so they were very distressed, as you can imagine, because the space slug was their responsibility. And they had already been starting to think that, well, feel a little bit guilty about keeping it pent up in a cage, and they were thinking, well, maybe we should free this space slug at some point, because they noticed that it had been somewhat small for a space slug. It should have been growing bigger, but they could talk all they wanted about that. The real point was they had to find their space slug. And they looked around for evidence, and they saw there was a little bit of burnt metal from the cage floating in space, and they decided to follow the direction that metal was floating, and they couldn't see anything that would possibly indicate that the space slug, Ralphie Artichoke, was anywhere to be seen, until they noticed a little bit of strangeness in the infrared scope in the ship. You see, they used this scope to detect other ships, and one of the there was a sharp drop in radiation in one direction, and I thought, that's a strange anomaly. Usually you only see that sort of thing when there are sea slugs around, and there aren't any sea slugs around here, unless that's Ralphie Artichoke. And they followed the direction of this radiation anomaly to see what was up. And that's when they saw a very familiar ship indeed. It was, why, that ship belongs to the vastly newly improved Trioculus, doesn't it? Said Darth. Yes, I think it does, said Joe. I wouldn't be surprised if Trioculus were behind this space slug kidnapping, said Darth. And they turned on the radio, and they tried to communicate with the ship, but the radio waves were being absorbed into Trioculus's ship, and suddenly they heard Trioculus on the radio, and which was also a television screen, which appeared in front of them, and he laughed his evil laugh, which went something like this. Yes, Darth and Joe Vader, I should have known it was you trying to stop me in my various evil plans, but this one you shan't stop me in, because I have a genuine sea slug, and I'm going to use him. What are you talking about, said Darth. Yeah, said Joe, that's our sea slug. That's Ralphie Artichoke. Give him back. No way, said Trioculus. I stole him fair and square. What do you want him for, said Darth. I can use his incredible sea slug ability to absorb light, so no one will be able to see my ship or detect it, no matter what instruments of detection they use. I'm going to smear this Ralphie Artichoke all over the outside of my ship, causing all light to be absorbed. I'll be invisible. I'll be able to do my evil deeds, attacking planets at will, with nobody, even you, won't be able to stop me. Darth and Joe Vader, this is my most evil plan yet. And Joe said, but you can't smear Ralphie Artichoke on the outside of your ship. That would kill him. I'm evil, said Trioculus. I don't care if I kill him. Oh, good point, said Darth, but we're going to stop you. Oh, really? Well, I've already learned how to aim Ralphie Artichoke so that you can't see me anymore. And Ralphie Artichoke, they saw, was held in some sort of metal claw, and Trioculus turned his ship so that it was very thin and there wasn't much showing toward Darth and Joe's ship, and he aimed the space slug in front of Darth and Joe's ship so that they couldn't see the ship anymore, because Ralphie Artichoke was in the way and he was so dark and it was hard to see, and Trioculus was moving off. And that's when Darth and Joe realized that they needed some sort of help, because they couldn't follow the ship very well. Luckily for them, Non-Violence Man flew from a nondescript location right toward their spaceship and landed on the outside and knocked on it. Hello, it's Non-Violence Man. And Darth and Joe opened up the hatch and they said, we're sure glad to see you. And he said, I'm glad to see everyone because I love all people and creatures. What can I do you for? Well, you see, this evil ship, the Trioculus ship, he stole our space slug, and he's going to kill him just to try to become invisible and do evil deeds. You've got to help us destroy him, but we can't shoot at the ship because we might hit Ralphie. No problem, said Non-Violence Man. I'll take care of it, because I fight the forces of evil, not the people doing evil. What do you mean, said Darth. I attack problems, not people, and this is clearly a problem that needs attacking. And Non-Violence Man flew out of their ship, but he bumped his head on the roof because he hadn't opened up the hatch. So they opened up the hatch for him. He rubbed his head, and he flew out of the ship because he had the ability to fly through space. And he flew toward Trioculus' ship. It was very difficult for him to see, but you see, Non-Violence Man also uses sonar to locate, now which is difficult, of course, in space, but there are small particles of dust, and he was using those to locate Trioculus's ship. And he got on the outside of Trioculus's ship, and he knocked on it. What do you want?
It's Non-Violence Man. I want to talk to you.
Leave me alone.
I can't leave you alone. You're causing a problem, and I must address the problem with you. I think I can help.
What do you mean you think you can help?
I'm trying to figure out what your problem is, and I think I can help if it has to do with invisibility.
Really? Okay, you can come in, said Trioculus, and he opened up the hatch of his ship, holding his breath. And Non-Violence Man came inside his ship. And he asked Trioculus, well, what's up? You seem to be very obsessed with this space slug that you have in the claw of your ship. And Trioculus explained, yes, I'm going to turn invisible. And would you like to hear my evil laugh?
No, that's not necessary.
Well, I'll give it to you anyway. That's quite an impressive evil laugh, said Non-Violence Man. Thank you, said Trioculus. I've been practicing this laugh for quite some time. I think it's effective on Darth and Joe Vader. They seem to be quite disturbed when I did it. I understand completely. They're also disturbed about the space slug. It seems to be their pet. That's no concern of mine, said Trioculus. Well, they're chasing you and trying to destroy you. Yeah, they do that a lot, said Trioculus. But I've got to use this space slug. You see, it's the only one around that I can get my hands on. The others are protected, and I can't get near them enough to steal them to cause my ship to be invisible.
Ah, so your real problem is you need your ship to be invisible in order to do evil things. Is that correct?
That's right. So you don't really need a space slug per se. Per se what?
It's just an expression, explained Non-Violence Man.
You need to be able to make your ship invisible. I think I can help, and that way, Darth and Joe Vader won't be angry with you because you can return their space slug. You'll be able to be invisible for all time and won't have to worry about the space slug juice washing off your ship when you go through a meteor shower. And you'll be able to fly around and do your evil deeds. Sounds great, said Trioculus. What's your plan? And Non-Violence Man explained how light can be bent around a ship using tiny particles of crystals, which each individually bend light to the next crystal. If you spray a thin film around your ship, any light will come and hit your ship and go all the way around and keep going. And this is actually better than space slugs, because space slugs don't eat every single frequency of radiation. Some types of radiation actually bounce back, and that's how they were able to locate space slugs originally in space. But through Non-Violence Man's technique, Trioculus' ship could be completely invisible. I'll help you do that in exchange for Darth and Joe's space slug, he said. And he made a deal with Trioculus, and Trioculus agreed and gave Non-Violence Man back the space slug, which he gave back to Darth and Joe Vader, who did a little dance and sang a little song. And the song went like this. Yay!